Hey, this is Mr. Janes. In this video, we'll be working with units and multi-step proportion problems and giving some tips for solving more difficult proportion problems. There are 4 steps I like to think about when I'm doing a difficult or multiple step proportion or ratio problem. First, I like to highlight the important information and write down all of the units involved in the problem. Now, I'm talking about units. I don't mean the actual values, the numbers. I'm talking about the kinds of values like centimeters, hours, seconds, minutes, grams, liters, numbers of apples, numbers of horses, whatever the units are, I want to write them down first. Number 2, I'm going to make a flowchart plan to move from one unit to the other. So kind of a list of steps I'm going to follow to solve that problem. How do I go from the numbers that I have right now to the answer that the problem is looking for? Third, I like to think about how I can use proportions to convert between units. So in number 2, I made a plan. And number 3, I'm actually going to think about how I can use ratios and proportions to go from one step of my plan to the next. Now, I've talked about a lot of different ways to find a proportion. We could use unit rates, where we divide down to find the value of one of something and then multiply back up. We could use multiplicative relationships. Maybe two values are double each other or triple. We could solve the proportion using inverse operations. Remember, to kind of cancel out the division, we'd multiply. We could use something like cross multiplication or other things like tables or charts. There's a whole bunch of ways to solve a proportion, and all of them are fair game. And a lot of times, more than one way works. And lastly, number 4, we follow our plan to find the answer and make sure that answer makes sense. So, number 1, we're going to highlight the important information and write down all the units involved. Number 2, we'll make a kind of a flow chart or a plan to move from one unit to the other. Number 3, we'll think about how to go between the steps of our plan using some sort of proportion or ratio. And lastly, we'll actually execute and follow the plan and find the answer. Let's start with example 1. As I'm doing these examples, I might write quickly or highlight things quickly, so feel free to pause the video at any time to write down what you see on the screen. So example 1, I get paid $20 for every 2 hours. I work 40 hours per 5 days. How many dollars do I make in 15 days? So remember, step 1 is going to be to highlight all of the important information here. Now notice when I'm highlighting the important information, I'm highlighting the values, 20, in addition to the units, dollars, hours, things like that. So the next question is, how many different units are actually being used in this problem? Well, I've changed the color of my highlights to show you that there are 3 different units. We've got dollars in yellow, we've got hours in red, and we've got days in green. So 3 different units, dollars, hours, and days, which makes this a multi-step ratio or proportion problem because there aren't just 2 units like normal, there are 3. And so we're going to move on to step 2, where we think about how to make a plan. So let's think. At the start of this problem, they tell us we get paid $20 for every 2 hours. So the ratio there is dollars per hour. It's our starting ratio, dollars per hour. But then, what's the ratio that we need in our answer? Well, looks like the last part of this says how many dollars do I make in 15 days? So my ending ratio will have to be dollars per day. Okay. So now in step 3, I've got to figure out what values I'm going to use for each of these proportions. I'll need one proportion for dollars per hour, and then I'll need to do a second proportion to get to dollars per day. Again, this is a multi-step problem, 2 steps. So dollars per hour. Well, in the problem it says I get paid $20 every 2 hours, and I'll have to change that over to 40 hours to figure out how much you get paid for 40 hours. So that'll be step number 1 right there, the dollars per hour, kind of like part number 1. Once we know how much money you make in 40 hours, we can write a second proportion that uses that amount of money and 5 days to figure out how much money you make, how many dollars you make in 15 days. So all this information right here we'll have to use in part 2, where we write a proportion that relates dollars and days. Let's actually go ahead and do the math now. Let's write out these proportions and figure out how much money you make in 15 days. So There's a whole number of different ways you can use a proportion. You could find a unit rate. You could write the proportion out and try and cross multiply. You could look for a multiplicative relationship. And I'll actually do this problem two different ways. And the first time I'm going to use proportions, either cross multiply or find a multiplicative relationship. So let's start with the first step, writing a proportion for dollars per hour. Now the problem says I get paid $20 for every 2 hours, and we need to find out how much money you'd make after 40 hours. So my proportion would look like this: $20 per 2 hours. And that must be equal to some amount of money. Again, I'm using my units here, dollar symbols in hours, for every 40 hours. Okay, and now I see a multiplicative relationship here. To get from 2 to 40, you could multiply that denominator by 20. It's 20 times as much. So the numerator must follow the same way. Multiply by 20. That's how proportions work. So 20 times 20 leaves me with 400. So again, don't forget the units. So we make $400 after working for 40 hours. That's pretty good. The next step we said was to go from dollars to days. So let's look here. Now we know we make $400 per 5 days. We need to figure out how many dollars we make in 15 days. So 400 bucks, again, don't forget the units, every 5 days, and some amount of money, some number of dollars, after 15 days. Again, I'm seeing a multiplicative relationship here. To get from 5 to 15, I have to multiply by 3 times as large. So to get from 400, the amount of money I make in 15 days, I'll multiply by 3 as well. 400 times 3 is 1,200, or 1,200. So my final answer is I would make $1,200 in 15 days. Now, what if you didn't like writing these proportions and doing multiplicative relationships? Well, there's another way to do this, using maybe unit rates and cross multiplying. Let's try doing it that way. So for the first part, I had to figure out how much money I made in 40 hours. Now, instead of doing it this way, I could have taken $20 per 2 hours and divided those to find out that I make $10 per hour, per 1 hour. But then I work 40 hours. Then I'd have to go and say that if I make $10 per hour, multiply that by 40 hours, and find out that I make $400 for those 40 hours. Again, notice that it's the same amount that I had before, $400 for 40 hours. What if in the second step, I didn't want to find that multiplicative relationship. Instead, I wanted to, maybe cross multiply. Again, I would have had $400 every 5 days. And I would have had X dollars every 15 days. I am trying to figure out how much money you make in those 15 days. So, okay, 400 times 15 ends up being 6,000. Okay, and then X times 5, well, that's just going to be 5X. And then I finish solving by dividing both sides by 5. And I'd get 1,200 equals X. So in fact, either way you do it, you're still getting the same answer, $1,200 in 15 days. So to review, number 1, I figured out what units I'm using in this problem. Number 2, I made a plan to go from dollars per hour to dollars per day. Number 3, I thought about what are the numbers I'm going to use in each step of my problem and how am I going to write those proportions out. And lastly, I actually did the math and found out that you make $1,200 in 15 days. Let's go to example 2. We're going to go a little more quickly for example 2 and 3 because I think you're getting the hang of these steps. So again, number 1, let's highlight the important information and write down all the different units we're using here. Lauren plans to exercise for 1 hour today. She started by doing push-ups for 20 minutes, that's important, and then running for the remainder of the time. So running for the remainder of the time. There's no number there, that's probably going to be important. Lauren can run 3 miles, definitely value the 3 miles, in 25 minutes. How many miles will she run today? So what are all the different units going on there? Now the interesting thing here is that although we're talking about time, there's three different units of time. At the beginning, we talk about the total time, right, that you're exercising. But also we talk about the time we're doing, what is that, push-ups? That's up in orange. Okay, and also the running times, the time running. Lastly, we're talking about how many miles we run. So there are actually quite a few different units here. So what's the plan going to be? Well, at the end, so at the end first, at the end, we're going to need to talk about how many miles we run per minute. So at the very end, we're going to have to do miles per minute, because after all, it says how many miles will she run today, and we're talking about in some length of time. Right? But before that, they don't actually tell us how long she ran, so we're going to figure out her running time. So how long did she run? We're going to find the running time. Okay. All right. So in step 3 is let's think about how we're going to do that. Let's see. It said they ran for 1 hour with 20 minutes of push-ups, and she ran for the remainder of that time. So that'll be the first part right there, number 1. And then the second part, this is Lauren can run 3 miles in 25 minutes. How many miles did you run today? That'll be the second part, right? We convert, or we write a proportion for miles and minutes. So let's dig right in. It says she ran for 1 hour. That's 60 minutes, but 20 of that was push-ups. So it means only 40 minutes was running. So again, label that minutes running. Okay, great. Now we know how many minutes you ran. Next, to go from miles to minute. Well, it says Lauren can run 3 miles in 25 minutes. So how many miles can she run in 40 minutes? Again, we got the 40 from the last step. Now you could either look for a multiplicative relationship, but it's kind of hard to see here. So let's just go to cross multiplying. 3 times 40 is 120. X times 25 is 25x. And divide both sides by 25. And you find that x equals about 4.8 miles that she ran. Nice. Again, number 1, we found those units. Number 2, we made a plan. Number 3, we thought about what kind of information we're going to use for each step of that plan. And lastly, we did the math out and found out she ran 4.8 miles. Notice that this step right here didn't actually involve a proportion. We just had to find the actual running time by subtracting the amount that she exercised in total, 60 minutes, from the amount of push-ups she did, which was 20 minutes. So don't be afraid to not use a proportion, especially when you're not given a certain amount, like how much she ran. You might have to subtract or add, figure that out. In example 3, where it says there are 8 people wearing red in our class and 12 people wearing blue. What proportion of the entire class is wearing red? Okay, so again, what's the important information here? So I've highlighted the 8 people wearing red and the 12 people wearing blue, but you might have missed that actually they're also talking about the entire class. So it's going to be important to know how many people are in the entire class as well. So there are actually 3 different units going on here. The people wearing red, the people wearing blue, and the entire class. So the first thing we're going to need to do in our plan is find the entire people in our class. Then we'll need to actually write the proportion of people wearing red to the people in the entire class. So to start, we'll need these 8 people and the 12 people wearing blue to figure out how many people there are in the entire class. It's part 1. And then we'll need those 8 people wearing red and how many people there are in the entire class to write the proportion. That's step 2. Let's go ahead and do it. So in the first part here, if there are 8 people wearing red and 12 people wearing blue, it means there are 20 people in the entire class, 20 people total. That was pretty easy. What's the second step going to look like? Well, they want the proportion of people wearing red to the entire class. There are only 8 people wearing red and a total of 20 people in the class. So if we do 8 over 20 and simplify our ratio, we have 2 to 5.